Hello, everyone. How you all doing today? Yeah? Doing well? Good. I just took a nap in the Rehumanize room. It was great. I did not mean to take a nap. Definitely, it was like, I'm just going to sit back and rest for a minute. And then fell asleep. So it's been a wonderful and rejuvenating weekend, and I'm so grateful that you all could attend. I'm grateful that Catherine could be here. She's a pro-life icon. And I really hope that y'all can gain something from this session that you didn't know before. So today we're going to be talking about restorative justice. Is anyone here familiar with that term? A couple people? Okay. To understand what restorative justice is, I think we first need to start at square one and ask the question, what is justice? So maybe you were thinking of a certain superhero, like Batman. I am justice. I am the knight. Right? Maybe you're thinking of that. Or maybe you were thinking of that really cute tween clothing store, right? It used to be limited to, right? No. So clever, but that's not really what we're going for today. Some dictionary definitions of justice read simply just behavior or treatment, with a thesaurus list including fairness, equality, impartiality, honesty, and righteousness. But all of these words mean different things and don't on an individual level cut to the heart of what justice is, though I would like to consider them closely related. What I've colloquially heard as the definition of justice is to give one what is their due. I do want to mention that the specific realm of justice, which we'll be addressing today, is not so much in the vein of social justice and distribution of goods, so much as the specific subtopic of criminal justice, in response to a wrong that has been committed by an individual, typically. The two, however, are connected inasmuch as they both relate back to the definition of to give one what is their due. So let's say that we acknowledge that the justice system has the responsibility to protect rights, to act in fairness, to act in impartiality, and righteousness. I think that in a model that values human beings for their intrinsic worth, justice and mercy are so inextricably linked that to tear them apart would be to act contrary to human dignity. And in doing so, would act contrary to authentic justice. But why? So let's look at our moral foundation. A moral and ethical foundation should be transferable to nearly any ethical situation that you might encounter. So in a question of criminal justice, it's vital to go back to that solid foundational ethical underpinning. In the consistent life ethic realm, I like to put forth a model of personalism, which is, in brief, to respect the inherent dignity of each and every person. Human beings, as beings with rational nature, are persons, as the central value of all moral action. When we look at justice as serving the person and each and every human being, then we understand that mercy must go hand in hand. When violence is off the table because we understand that each and every human being has inherent, intrinsic, immutable dignity, then mercy is indispensable. Well, let's look at the model that we currently have. Our nation has one of the most harsh and inhumane justice systems in the world. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, an estimated 6,613,500 persons were in U.S. adult correctional systems as of December 31st, 2016. Over 2 million of those people were incarcerated, representing about 4% of the U.S. population, and the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Our system and our culture often sees incarceration as an end in itself, for the sake of punishment alone. But as we have heard from those on the inside, prisons act like crime university, and according to the Pew Center, recidivism rates are regrettably around 43%, meaning that 43% of people who are incarcerated from a crime will end up committing another crime and ending up back incarcerated. The system isn't one that seems to be aimed at or especially successful at rehabilitation and restoration. An especially dehumanizing aspect of the U.S. system lies in mandatory minimum sentences. These mandatory minimum sentences are regulated and set by Congress, not judges, and they require automatic minimum prison terms after convictions for certain crimes. According to the organization Families Against Mandatory Minimums, most mandatory minimum sentences apply to drug offenses, but Congress has also enacted them for other crimes, including certain gun, pornography, and economic offenses. As an example of a mandatory minimum sentence, under federal law, selling 28 grams of crack cocaine triggers a minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. And if you're caught selling 280 grams of crack, you'll face a minimum of 10 years behind bars, even if the judge does not think that you need such a long sentence. So, what are the issues with this current model? The retributive model of justice that we have been raised with is really a statist, impersonal model that views crimes as essentially breaking the king's peace. Crimes that are committed are not crimes against another human being, they are against the state. I just find this so incredibly dehumanizing. It really removes the human element from any sort of justice, from any sort of restoration. This model is inherently anti-personal because instead of seeking to repair relationships between the offender and the offended and the community, instead of acknowledging that one party has harmed another, the state comes in and acts like the harm committed was done to them. The needs of the offended party really don't come into the picture. But when we seek to find a model of justice that is based in personalism, that is focused on the life and dignity of every human being, what are we looking for? To give one what is their due in a personalist justice system would not be to seek revenge, but to both respect the needs and dignity of the offender and the offended, to repair harms, make amends, and seek the good of all parties. So what should the goals of a justice system be? According to a personalist model. The first task is to recognize and acknowledge legitimate grievance. So, acknowledge that the harm was done. Say it out loud. Secondly, make amends for or reconstruct loss or damage wherever that is possible. We know that in the loss of a human life, no such reconstruction is really truly possible. And taking another life doesn't solve that problem. Number 3, reduce recidivism. So we don't want to see people who have committed a crime reoffending. We don't want to see them doing that same thing and entering a cycle of violence. Fourthly, we want it to be reasonably uniform. We want justice to be applied fairly across demographic groups. Number 5, we want to establish trust in the legal system and in the given community. So not only do we want to see a fairly uniform standard of justice, we also want it to be tailored to the individuals and to create trust in a given community. So here's a thesis that I want y'all to remember. A system of justice ought to be based in the inherent dignity of the human person, the dignity of both the offender and the offended. We should seek a model that makes amends and seeks to generate positive outcomes instead of preferring to ensure a balance of harms. So I've talked about restorative justice and why we, as people who value and uphold human dignity, should pursue this model. But you might be asking, why in particular is it crucial for people who want to end abortion to promote this model? You might recall that Donald Trump saying he thinks that women who have abortions should be punished. Or maybe you heard about the story of Bob Nonini, a candidate for lieutenant governor of Idaho, who nodded when asked if he would support the death penalty for the crime of abortion. Or perhaps you recall the news story about conservative writer Kevin Williamson, who was rightfully fired from his position at The Atlantic for saying the following: I would totally go with treating abortion like any other crime, up to and including hanging. Which kind of, as I said, I'm kind of squishy about capital punishment in general, but I've got a soft spot for hanging as a form of capital punishment. I tend to think things like lethal injection are a little too antiseptic. Yike,
yeah.
y'all.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Some conservative leaders were calling Williamson's firing chilling and are calling his perspective mainstream pro-life. But this isn't about chilling conservative speech. This is about a private publication not giving a platform to someone who is actively calling for violence. And holy smokes, y'all, the pro-life movement should not ever be calling this position mainstream. Not only because that's not the mainstream position, but also because supporting the death penalty for abortion is contrary to our foundational principles. Of course, while these propositions from Nanini and Williamson are for the day in the future when abortion is made illegal, this is something that we need to be talking about now. Every action that we take helps build the future. So if we want to see a pro-life world, we need to be building it up bit by bit in the here and now.
Agreed.
At Rehumanize International, we oppose the death penalty categorically, regardless of the crime of the perpetrator. We know that violence doesn't end violence, it extends it. We know that further violence just passes on trauma and oppression, that the death penalty doesn't unkill a victim, nor does it deter crime. But especially in the case of abortion, where there is often cultural, familial, social, and financial coercion and abuse, we need to be advocates not for further violence and retribution, but instead for restoration and healing. As we've discussed already, our current justice system seeks retribution. Our current justice system is broken. It disproportionately targets and convicts people of color, and for-profit prisons exploit incarcerated people and treat them with inhumanity. This is not a system that upholds human dignity. In a restorative model, as we laid out earlier in the presentation, we should acknowledge that violence creates a rift between the offender and the offended, between the offender and the community. We should not seek to further disintegrate our human community through the continued harms against the offender of further violence, of incarceration, or of an eye for an eye. We should see crime as an injustice against individuals rather than against the state. Remember, we do not belong to the state, right? I think all of us would find that a little bit offensive. Like, we're not slaves of the state. We don't exist for the good of the state. The state exists to serve humanity. We should seek instead the reintegration of the offender to the community, to make our community as whole as possible, to respect the dignity of all. So after these news stories broke, I knew that I had to throw my efforts into building a pro-life culture in our justice system, to affirm the dignity of both preborn children and their parents in a world where abortion will be illegal. I want to see a pro-life movement that rejects violence and retribution as a solution. I want to see a pro-life movement that seeks to restore community where violence has broken that bond. I want to see a pro-life movement that includes restorative justice plans in every piece of legislation that seeks to ban certain forms or outlaw other forms of abortion. I think that if the pro-life movement embraces this restorative justice model after abortion, it will not only be a living testament to our foundational principles of our shared humanity, but will also demonstrate a central necessary compassion in the effort to abolish abortion. We should always approach those whom have had abortions with compassion. But this compassion does not prohibit us from protecting the most defenseless of all, the preborn. We can stand for the dignity of all. We don't have to choose between a mother and her preborn child. So, the thing that I challenge you to do is refuse to accept a paradigm that pits certain human beings against others. Love them both. We can stand for justice and still stand by the central idea that every human being, by the mere fact that they are human, deserve to live free from violence. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine now to talk a little bit more about how we actually implement this idea and what that looks like.
Thank you. Okay, y'all. Give me 2 seconds because even when it's supersized, I still can't see it without glasses. Sorry about that. So I am president and CEO of Americans United for Life. We work towards justice for all. We work towards the day when every single human being is welcomed in life and protected in law. And this is something that has been really close to my heart for a number of years, for decades, if I can date myself. In fact, I wrote and presented one of my high school debate speeches for an entire year on California's 3 strikes law, and the problems that have gone along with that. But in addition to my legal degree, I also have history. One of my undergrads was history, and so I'd like to take us back a little bit and just take a look back at what this idea, yeah, exactly, a little bit of like Wayback Machine, about what this idea of restorative justice, where it comes from, and what does it look like. Because to some people who maybe aren't as familiar with it, maybe aren't here at Life, Peace, Justice, it can sound a little hippie, a little new agey, a little whatever. But it's actually been seen all throughout history in bits and pieces, all the way back to 2050 BC. In the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code still in existence. And actually, I also, in addition to my legal work and everything else, I also teach literature and art history classes as well. And so whenever I'm doing the ancients, I always point them to this. It's one of my favorite things. I love just showing them. This is such a critical piece of where we come from, and the kindergartners love it. Actually, they really do. But anyway, models of justice based on this kind of person-to-person restitution were actually quite common up until the prevailing law of the 11th century came to view citizens as primarily subjects of the king's rule instead of being worthy in and of themselves. Now, there are historical representations of this model that are used even today. For example, the Catholic Church's model of excommunication, despite what the general public may actually think, it's actually based on this idea of pointing out that the individual has already separated themselves from the body of Christ through intentional, deliberate, and public sin, and often additionally causing public scandal. The goal there is not to be punitive. It's not to be vengeful, but instead it's to point out the disunity that already exists. It's to work for reunification and reintegration of the member. And this is often achieved by 1, acknowledging harms through a confession of sin, 2, penance in an effort to make amends for the wrongs that have been committed, and 3, through the grace of the sacrament, to endeavor to sin no more, and thereby working to reduce recidivism. The progress is reasonably uniform and done properly works to engender confidence in the system. Other examples of this restorative model exist largely in tribal communities where subsidiary still reigns strong and the person-to-person aspect of justice is retained. Additionally, there are peaceful parenting models that seek to use a restorative model of justice instead of just authoritative retribution. So instead of a child getting a spanking or a timeout, just being immediately sent to timeout, this kind of parenting model seeks to help the child understand and acknowledge the harm, apologize, and make reparations. And you never know what kind of punishment, what kind of sort of authoritarian model is going to really strike a child. Some people might think, well, spanking, that's off the table, but time out maybe. But actually, it's my uncle-in-law. He still tells the story 60 years later of how his older sister sent him to time out, and he always said, I would never do that to my kids. It was so horrible. It was so authoritative. And so this peaceful parenting model, it really allows for positive reinforcement. And there are institutional versions of this as well. They can be seen in various schools around the nation, including in San Francisco, where instead of being kicked out of school or being sent straight to detention, students are asked to listen to each other, to write or speak apologies, and to work out solutions to the offense and the potential systemic issue. You may also have heard about schools in Baltimore. There's one school in particular that's teaching the students to practice mindfulness and meditation to cope with trauma, stress, and anger. And as a parent myself, I remember when my 11-and-a-half-year-old, she was 1.5 at the time, and I sent her to school with me when I was going to law school, and they had a little child care center, and they had this practice that I had never heard of before. It was called conscious discipline. Have any of you heard of conscious discipline? It's one of a number of different methodologies, but it's embraced in 47 countries, 22 languages, and what they describe themselves as, they say that they have a foundation of safety, connection, and problem solving. They say that they're leading a revolution of the heart as concepts initially applied in the classroom extend to every facet of our lives. They say that they are evidence-based, trauma-informed, based on social and emotional learning, turning everyday situations, again, into learning opportunities. And I've seen that myself with some of the kids that I've seen go through this process. Conscious discipline can be transformative, restorative. And all of these options present more restorative options that seek to restore community instead of imposing further harms upon the offender. Now, a current example of a partially restorative justice model within our own modern U.S. justice system is the drug courts model that's been instituted in various jurisdictions around the nation, including right here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And in fact, Amy's senior capstone at Carnegie Mellon, focused exclusively on this model and how and why it is effective. The model works by offenders of nonviolent drug crimes, acknowledging the wrong they have committed, acknowledging their addiction, seeking to repair the addiction and the harms done through community involvement and service, and working to reduce recidivism by healing addiction and building supportive communities to maintain accountability. And this process, again, is both reasonably uniform, but also profoundly personal, profoundly relational. And according to the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, 75% of graduates of the drug court model remain arrest-free 2 years after graduation, and family reunification rates are 50% higher for drug court participants than for the normal justice system for drug offenders. According to the National Institute of Justice, the drug court model is reducing recidivism anywhere from 17 to 26% and saving our system a ton of money, upwards of $6,700 per participant, because treatment of addiction is cheaper than repeat prison stays. This drug court model much more effectively achieves the goals of justice than the normal model, the retributive model used for drug offenders, achieving input from all parties, restoration to family and community, and a massive reduction in recidivism. So we've seen how restorative justice models work in two different ways, but how would applying the restorative model to the violence of abortion in particular achieve the goal of a justice system? As persons, we are personal beings. We are capable of and meant to be members of a community. When a harm is done, it breaks the bonds of community. It causes suffering and disunity for both the offender and the offended, and the answers that we should seek should work to restore harmony to the community through restoration and reintegration. If we seek to repair harms with more harms, to the point of even cutting off the offender from all community, writing them off as a lost cause, and declaring them as being past the point of potential conversion, or if we seek retribution merely for its own sake, we are not respecting the dignity of the person. An act of violence done, even to an offender, only continues to break that bond of community and continue the cycle of violence. Now, the issue in the dialogue surrounding justice and abortion stems from the fact that pro-life folks, we don't want to punish someone for having had an abortion. I'm post-abortive. I talk about it. I don't want women to be punished. We do not ever want to be seen as being anti-woman because we stand for the dignity, the inherent human dignity of both mother and child. So current legislation on the books that would be enacted if Roe were to be overturned does not really include the woman in the picture of justice. It is only the abortionist who is to be punished. But if we move away from that model of justice as punishment, and instead as restoration, we see that we must incorporate not only the abortionist, but also the woman, the community, very potentially the partner, the parents, the friends. Abortion is something that touches everyone, all of us. And so our entire culture, our entire nation, our entire global community must be committed to pursuing restoration. We think that there are some vital aspects to consider and include in legislation that aims to build a restorative justice model after abortion. And I'll take these by category. When it comes to community and institutions, how is the community at all culpable in coercion to abortion? What about the place of business? The financial system, the academic institutions, have they pressured the parents into thinking that bearing a child right now would lead to job loss, losing housing, losing the opportunity to finish college? And, even at my law school, I had to lead the charge on a more inclusive childcare model that would have allowed childcare for children younger than 18 months. I know one young woman who was in Parents Club with me. She was paying ridiculous amounts of money down in D.C. Until she could get her child into the childcare system. And so just talking to the administration was really critical there. But that's something that we need to look at, the institution, the community, the society. The abortionist, including the healthcare team. How are the staff at the abortion facility, if it is a facility, or the abortionist himself or herself or the pharmaceutical company culpable in coercion to or participation in abortion? Have they pressured the parents? Did the staff give the impression that abortion was the only way out of this situation? Did they force the mother to go through with an abortion even after she had changed her mind? Was there adequate informed consent? So often, no. I asked to see my ultrasound. I was denied. The woman, and this is tough, but how is the woman who has had an abortion culpable in procuring that abortion? Did she choose the abortion because she didn't know about the humanity of the preborn child? Did she choose it out of carelessness or malice? Or, much more likely, did she choose it out of fear, out of coercion or pressure? Maybe from a partner, from society, from any number of sources. How is the partner culpable in all of this? Did they attempt to save their child, or did they pressure, coerce, threaten, force, or harm their partner into having an abortion? We have to look at the parents, especially if the person who has had an abortion as a teenager. We must ask how their parents are culpable in this situation. Did they try to save their grandchild's life? Did they offer support to their daughter or their son? Or did they tell her that they would kick her out and she would lose all financial support if she didn't have an abortion? Lastly, on this surely very incomplete list, it's important to assess the influence and potentially pressure from friends, whether they may have had abortions and are trying to justify their decision by influencing, seeing others around them making the same choice or not. Either way, friends may see abortion as the only way out of a difficult situation, and they may pressure or coerce a woman to have an abortion. How may friends be culpable? Of course, in many of these cases, restoration is also going to necessitate someone less like a punisher judge and more like a counselor judge. We want to get at the root of why this violence was perpetrated. We want to address those social ills. And in light of the reality of perpetration-induced traumatic stress, we both want to acknowledge the harm done and also get those who were involved in abortion the care that they need to heal from participation in such violence. And it does impact everyone involved. So perhaps we will also need to involve therapists, educators, and physicians who perform only nonviolent health care. In all of this, we see that in a restorative model, the goal is not punishment, but rather restoration. We understand then that we must involve all of these other parties to truly build a world where violence is unthinkable. Now that we've discussed who the system should involve, we should also assess what the process could look like. As for what the restoration process could look like, we have a couple of thoughts on that as well. Firstly, it must be understood that what we're recommending begins with the current justice system that we're living under as a given. Starting from today, where do we go to get to a fully restorative justice model? So we propose that restorative models be included in any legislation that seeks to limit or outlaw abortion. Recommendations and considerations could and should be tailored per bill to reflect the needs of restoration in specific cases. For example, if the bill is a basic 5-month, 20-week ban, the restoration process after a violation of the ban could and should include education on nonviolent alternatives to adverse fetal diagnosis, which, as we know, is one of the reasons why some women seek abortion after 20 weeks. We're looking towards connecting the family of the aborted child and the abortionist and the staff and anyone else who participated in the abortion to post-abortion healing, where they can all acknowledge the harm done and the very real loss of a child to violence, where they can rehumanize. Perhaps the family could also then be connected to community resources that can affirm life and support a woman and her family in a time of great crisis, so that recidivism would be much less likely. And this is especially crucial when you consider that nearly half of all abortions are procured by a woman who have had an abortion before in their lifetime. And as we know from Rachel's Vineyard successes, people who do go through post-abortion healing are much, much less likely to ever participate in abortion again. When we look at all the good in this model, from the foundational understanding of our shared human dignity to lowering the rate of repeat abortions, we can see how the opportunities for very real compassion and restoration are many. So in summary, how would this restorative justice model be better at achieving the goals than our current justice system, our system of retribution? By rejecting violence and by being based in person-to-person restitution, the restorative justice model respects human dignity. By effectively involving the offender and the offended and the community, getting everyone involved in creating justice, it reduces recidivism and therefore cost. By seeking to offer restoration and rehabilitation instead of a balance of harms, and through community involvement in creating justice, it restores families and communities to wholeness. Now, in our forum in the next session, we'd love to hear some of your ideas on how this restorative model of justice could be implemented and how we could better serve abortion vulnerable populations. So we look forward to that conversation.
Spoiler starting now.
Yeah, we're